Welcome to Beer Thunder, the War Thunder Sim channel where the only thing we cover is planes that are 15 and a half minutes old, because if it's older than 15 and a half minutes, it's obsolete and you should not play it. The fact that you clicked on a video featuring War Thunder props and sim means that your future wife has already preemptively left you.
Speaking of wife, guys, we've got the most married man on the planet, Albatross, in the background in this Spitfire LF Mark 9. I'm flying the K-84, and this is going to be a video discussing whether or not Japan is overpowered and busted, because it's a reaction video. Disgusting patir.
So I know that we got a new patch that just dropped with the F-18 and the SU-30, and I'm not covering those yet because I want to let the patch kind of mature a little bit, let some of the newer changes go through and see what happens before just jumping right back into it. And I've also just got burnt out on playing a lot of top tier lately, so I figured I'd switch it back up, go back to props for a little bit, showcase some other things, a little bit more of the game to kind of give you a full perspective. And IdahoBookworm, one of the better prop players in the game, one of the most prolific prop players in the game, put out a video basically claiming that Japanese planes are overpowered because they turn well. And because of that fact, because they turn well, they cancel out the ability of everybody else to dogfight within the game. And what happens is Japanese planes shoehorn everyone else into a more or less pure hit and run play style. And he approaches it from like a perspective of historical accuracy, because the zeros in real life are supposed to compress at high speeds where they don't turn very well, where if you force them to high speed, you should be able to outturn them, avoid them, and then get away from them. That's not something that's really accurately modeled within the game. And he applies his argument to all Japanese planes, where essentially if you fly Japan within War Thunder, you end up with all of the benefits of a Japanese plane with none of the drawbacks. And while Idaho's argument is presented in a compelling format, and I agree with a large part of it, I think it does ultimately miss the forest through the trees. I think it does not take into account the greater context that War Thunder exists in, and doesn't take into account the fact that the relationship that Japanese planes have with their opposition is not something that is particularly unique. The complaint that Japanese planes do not allow you to dogfight in their presence is not something that only happens if you're fighting Japan. It is something that is going to happen. Say, for instance, you're in a P-47 and there's a lot of 109 F4s. Guess what? The P-47, especially the earlier ones with lower engine power settings, are not capable enough to really handle the 109s in a dogfight. Yes, you can put up a good college try, but if the other guy has two opposable thumbs, more often than not, he is going to be favored to win, especially any kind of protracted dogfight. The same thing can be said with the Spitfire LF Mark 9 at 5.0 versus a lot of its 4.0 opposition. If you know how to use the plane is incredibly powerful. And speaking of power and overpowered, we have to kind of go back and kind of think about what makes planes overpowered and what makes their relationships imbalanced, because turning performance is not the only performance metric, and it's not the only one that matters, because just because a plane turns better than you doesn't mean that it is outright better. In fact, when I look at relationships within War Thunder, I try to consider the whole entire perspective. So for instance, at 5.0, the Ki-84 is one of the strongest 5.0s in the game. I would say it's even overpowered, busted, broken, disgusting, and a lot of people play it. But why do people play this plane? Is it just because it's Japanese and it turns better? And the answer is no. This is actually one of the few Japanese planes that behaves somewhat like a normal plane and has performance metrics that ends up being very similar to everything else, because unlike a lot of other Japanese planes, outrunning and outclimbing this thing is very hard, especially in a lot of your 5.0s and 4.0s. Something like the P-51D5 running its 64 inches of manifold pressure or its low manifold pressure setting will struggle to out-accelerate the Ki-84. The Ki-84, the reason that it is overpowered is because it's a good jack-of-all-trades plane that, even if it doesn't do one thing or everything better than everything, it will usually do one thing or the other in a way that is very intuitive to play. The flight model itself is very, very hand-holdy insofar that things like propeller torque are probably undermodeled. The plane doesn't really have any harsh wing stalls or anything like that. On the other hand, the Spitfire LF Mark 9 is also 5.0 and has very, very similar performance. It's a little bit slower, but it turns a good bit better. The only reason that people don't necessarily complain about this plane as much is because the flight model isn't nearly as intuitive, because the flight model seems to be like a little bit unstable, it's a little more floppy. It's easier to accidentally wing stall this plane, but once you get a feel for the controls in the plane, it becomes one of the best, if not one of the most broken 5.0 planes in the game. I would even go so far to say that the Spitfire LF Mark 9 is the best Spitfire in the game relative to its battle rating. And its presence at 5.0, especially in the hands of someone who's halfway capable, forces the Axis team to react to it in the same way that Allied teams have to react to Japanese planes. Planes like the BF-109F4, BF-109G6, and BF-109K4 are relatively capable of competing in dogfights against most of their American opposition. There are some matchups that are better for the 109, and there are some matchups that are better for the Americans. For instance, the P-47 is not a particularly great dogfighter against the 109F4. On the other hand, if you take an F4U-4 against a BF-109, the F4U-4 is favored to win. Planes like the P-38L and the 109G6 are basically a 50-50 matchup depending on the altitude, fuel state, and the experience of the pilot. Like for instance, pretty much anytime me and Idaho merge in, say for instance, 109G6 versus P-38L, that fight is going to go all the way to the deck, and that fight is going to come down to very, very thin margins, or more often than not, what it comes down to is whoever's allies get there to third party first and kill the other guy. And usually when he plays, he's usually playing with two other guys, and those guys are usually in Spitfire LF Mark 9s. And the LF Mark 9's presence at 5.0 means that the calculus of the way that I have to approach the game is changed. It means that in order for the 109 to be viable, at all times I have to be aware of the presence of Spitfires in the matchmaker and alter my tactics accordingly. I no longer have the luxury of trying to dogfight a P-38 because I know that as soon as I do, I am going to have two Spitfire LF Mark 9s glued directly to my 6, and I will be in a plane that turns worse, is slower to accelerate, and has a lower top speed at sea level. It means that even in the worst case scenario, in order for me to dictate the fight, I really have to be aware of their position at all times and my energy state, because the only advantage that I have is top speed, and that top speed advantage is only at some altitudes, because at sea level the Spitfire LF9 is actually faster than the 109G6. The limitations that the Spitfire LF9 imposes on planes like the 109 is identical to the limitations that the Ki-84 places on other 5.0 aircraft, and in some ways those limitations on the Axis side are a little bit harder to work around because you don't usually have the luxury of being faster than everything in the bracket. So while a BF-109 might have the capability to outturn a P-51, it doesn't have the capability of running away, and when you combine the tools in the toolbox that the Allied team has, this creates some particularly challenging situations. Like the worst possible situation to kind of be in a prop game is having to run away from something that turns better than you, and then having a guy that has a higher top speed be able to run you down, force you to turn, where the second guy catches up and kills you. And if you are placed in that situation where you're running away from a turn fighter, and then you have a faster plane on your 6 that's going to close the distance, you only have a few options, and none of them are really great. In a lot of ways, speed and acceleration performance is just as important for viability in EC as turn performance. In fact, I would argue that's even more important because it does allow you to pick and choose when and where you want to fight and for how long. It does give you counterplay options against all of those planes that turn better. In fact, I would go so far to say that it is even more important than turn performance because it gives you viable offensive and defensive options against multiple opponents at the same time. That is not something that a pure turn fighter is really capable of. So while the Zero can spend the game rotating around its own axis in a very tiny turning circle, and that's a very decisive performance metric if a furball develops, as soon as people decide not to engage in furballs, or as soon as you get a couple of players that understand how boom and zooming and how energy fighting works, those planes become a lot less viable after the fact. In reality, the best Japanese planes in the game are those that end up sacrificing some of that turn performance in order to be more viable at high speeds, to have higher top speeds, better climb rates, and whatnot. The Ki-84 is a perfect example, by the way. The Ki-84, if you haven't been paying attention, has more or less lost every single dogfight against the LF Mark 9. The LF Mark 9, at the same battle rating, will outturn the Key 84. The only place that the Key 84 enjoys an advantage over the LF Spitfire is in terms of speed performance. And in terms of ergonomics, the Key 84 flight model is much more forgiving. It's much easier to use at its max performance. Conversely, the Spitfire LF Mark 9 flight model does take some time to get used to. However, in the background duels that you're seeing, me and Albatross really don't have a lot of experience in the LF Mark 9 as far as getting down exactly where its max performance is at all times. It was, even with the learning curve, it was still relatively easy to learn how to beat Key 84s with it. This is also why I ended up switching to the Griffin Spitfire, because the LF versus Key 84 matchup is not particularly interesting once you understand the basics. And the basics are that the LF9 does outturn the Key 84, and even if you are not max performing the plane at all times, riding the bleeding edge of the angle of attack limit, you can still pretty easily whip your plane around and win. So while the LF flight model might be harder to use and harder to master, you don't really have to master it in order to outperform the Key 84. Now, let's take a quick detour away from the dueling footage and let's look at a chart. This chart that I have on your screen right now is what I'm calling sustained turn rate versus speed at sea level. Basically, on the y-axis, you have numbers ranging from 15 all the way up to 31 that are showing sustained turn rate, and then the numbers on the bottom is top speed at sea level in kilometers per hour. And this just shows kind of the relationship of where the good turning planes sit in terms of speed performance and where the fast planes sit in terms of turn performance. Basically, we can see that on the left-hand side of the screen at the very kind of top left, we have the A6M2 and the B239. These planes are very good at turning, but when compared to everything else on this chart, they are relatively slow. Now, the one thing to take into account with this chart is it's not perfectly accurate. Just because the A6M2 and the B239 are similar in sustained turn performance, it does not mean that the A6M2 or the B239 wins consistently against each other, because I cannot plot how power to weight ratio and energy retention affect the outcome of a dogfight. This is simply a visual tool with a limited use, and the limited use is for me to talk through like what planes might be OP, what planes might overperform, what planes are actually good in EC versus ones that are bad. And if we move all the way down to the bottom right, we'll see that we have the Wyvern, the MB5, and the FW190D9 all kind of like clustered up in a line. It basically means what this chart is showing, that these planes are fast, but they don't turn well. And in order to really, really understand this chart, it would need to be sorted by the battle rating range that you're playing in. Because, for instance, the 190D9 on this chart looks like it's a fast plane. Guess what? It is fast when compared to a bunch of stuff that is way, way, way below 5.7. Because if you look at the D9 and you move up to the top right, or you move up one space to the right, you see the F4U-4 and the F4U-4B. Those planes are faster than the 190D9, and they turn better. They do everything better than the D9. And anyone that has played the D9 against a dedicated F4U-4 or an F4U-4B, you get one of those planes behind you, you're like, well, my game's over. It's basically not playable. The 190s are probably some of the most thoroughly mediocre planes in the game once you break it down into performance numbers. The American planes, the F4U-4B, at 5.7 is faster than everything. And on the chart, if you compare like the next closest German thing, you have the 109K4. The 109K4 turns worse and is slower. The 4B, there is a reason that at 5.7 on 5.7 days, the F4U-4Bs come out to play. Moving up on the chart, we look at another plane that I consider to be really, really strong, almost borderline overpowered, depending on what bracket you're playing it in. We have the Yak-3U. The Yak-3U is one of the few turn fighters that's also pretty darn fast. Its energy retention is very good power to weight ratio. At low altitudes, the Yak-3U is incredibly powerful. And then we kind of move over to the left. We look at where the Key 84 is. Where's the Key 84? It's sitting right on the 23 degree per second line and right around 585 kph. The closest performance matchup to it is the Spitfire Mark 14, which is a little bit slower, turns a little bit better. The Spitfire LF Mark 9, because it is the low flying version of the Spitfire, is tuned for low altitude. It is technically faster than the Key 84, and it turns much better. And we know that it turns much better, and we know how the matchup works out because we already have the footage from before, and anyone that is semi-competent can go out and test this. And then we move to the middle, and we have the median. So our red dot is the median, and we've got the G56. The G56 is like the most standardized plane of all time, along with the Yak-3. And the TA152H is a little bit faster than the median, turns a little bit worse, although that is a little bit deceptive. And the reason it's deceptive is it does not take into account the energy retention and the ability to spam flaps, like the TA152H versus the, say for instance, the Yak-3 matchup is a little bit more dynamic. The Yak-3, I think, could still eventually win, but it's a really annoying one to do. The same thing with like the P51C versus TA152H. The 152H in dogfight does beat the 51C. One of the things to realize, though, is that you could probably go through this chart and look at any matchup and look at any battle rating bracket and draw a line through the fastest plane for the battle rating bracket, and more often than not, it's going to be in an American plane. We look at 5.7, F4U4B. We look at 5.3, we got the F4U-4. We look at 4.7, we got an outlier in the form of the MB5, which that's not American, but it does outrun everything at 4.7. You can play this plane very easily and be basically immune to things. The 109s, on the other hand, are kind of thoroughly mediocre performance-wise, at least in these metrics, because if I plotted climb rate, which is also a very important performance metrics, they would look a little bit better. The 109, F4, G6, and K4, I kind of all sit below the median. But with that being said, I do have a lot of experience in them, and the power to weight ratio on them means that at low speeds against things like P51s, the 109s are favored to win. Same thing with like the P38. It's on this chart, it says P48. It's a typo, but it's supposed to be P38 LO. Its closest performance matchup is the 109 G6. And depending on the altitude that you engage at, the 109 G6 can outmaneuver the 38, or the 38 can outmaneuver the 109. It's a very balanced matchup. The F6F, on the other hand, is kind of like looks mediocre in terms of sustained turn rate, but its initial turn is really good. Its low stall speed does more than enough to make up for its lack of quote-unquote turn performance. Also, it's 3.7. If we look at something like the N1K2, the N1K2, by the way, is worse than the Key 84 in pretty much every single way. It's at 6.0. It starts at 6.0, and it is basically slightly faster than like the American XP55. The American XP55 is ridiculous at 3.0. It does not need to be at 3.0, and it is one of those planes that you put the thing in an 800 kph dive, put it right near its rip speed, and you pull up on the stick, and you're immediately doing 12 to 14 G turns right away. It has the same issue that Idaho was complaining about the Zeros having. And you have the Key 44 High, which is also 3.0 for some reason. You move all the way down, the RE2005 and the G55, both of these planes are 5.0 and 5.3 respectively. Speed performance-wise, garbage, abysmal, slow as fuck. Not very good. They're good at turn fighting, and it does catch a lot of people off guard. But relative to the battle rating, the F4U4B is a lower battle rating and has like an enormous top speed advantage, an enormous acceleration advantage. And the G56 is an improvement over the G55, but it's basically right at the median. Its performance match is basically a regular old Yak-3. And that can be borne out. There have been tournaments in the past where it's been Yak-3, Yak-9U, and G56. And the one that consistently won the RB tournaments was the Yak-3. The Yak-3 is just a little bit better than G56. Now, I don't think that would be true for Sim, because Sim does have better AOA limitations, so that sometimes you can get the plane to overperformance speed ranges that just aren't available in RB. Like the 109s do get like basically around a 1 degree per second turn rate boost, just from the fact that they can maintain a higher angle of attack and complete their turn with the wing slats folded out. Now, I think one of the funniest takeaways from this chart is actually in this top left-hand corner here. The A6M2 is the plane that IdahoBookworm was complaining is completely busted because it doesn't experience elevator compression. But when you look at it in terms of top speed and sustained turn performance, the Finnish Buffalo, the next plane that he is going to review, has better performance at a lower battle rating. Here, let me show you just how ridiculous the Finnish Buffalo is. I'm going to be in a dive at nearly my rip speed, and I'm going to max pull without ripping the plane. Watch the limit on the left. Watch the G meter. All the way up to 22.4, and I'm basically flipped around instantly. Like, it's no wonder these guys end up playing this thing in order to counter Japanese turn fighters. It's just the same thing, but better. And I think the same mantra might be applicable to the American tech tree in general, because if you look at the American tech tree, especially the premium side of things, they basically have the better versions of everybody else's planes. So, for instance, the A6M2 is probably the strongest zero relative to its battle rating. Guess what version the Americans have in their premium lineup? The A6M2. Same thing goes for the early Key 61 that's at like 3.0. The same thing goes for the Spitfire LF Mark 9 that the Americans can also just buy. That isn't to say that the American tech tree is unique in its overpoweredness, because every tech tree has some stuff that's actually absolutely bonkers broken. The J2M2 at 3.7 is ridiculous. It does not belong at 3.7. That is not a very well balanced plane. The same thing goes for the Key 44, which is stuck at 3.0 for reasons that do not make any sense. The same can be said for things like the XP55 and the P39. Those planes are exceptionally good. The P39 has turning performance that is on par with or slightly superior to the BF109 F4, while being a full entire battle rating lower than it. The FW190s, on the other hand, the only niche they really fill is just being overall a mediocre plane that is slower than most of its American counterparts and gets outturned by them. The FW190, the Dora 9, can be very aggravating to fly in a competitive lobby because the plane doesn't do anything better than any of its peers, and if you're up against experienced players, planes like the F4U4B will very easily run you down and kill you, and you don't have any counterplay at that point. If you limit Axis teams to not having Japan on their side, or having Japan off in its own little matchmaker so people don't have to deal with the unpleasantness of fighting them, what does the Axis side really have left at that point? You've got 109s that are fairly competitive relative to their battle rating when compared to American planes in a turn fight. They have good climb performance, but their top speed is not very great, and their turn performance when compared to something like a Spitfire, especially an LF Mark 9, an F Mark 9, even a Griffin Spitfire, leaves a lot to be desired, while also being not fast enough to escape these planes. Even fast, non-maneuverable planes like the FW190 don't really fill a niche, because at the battle rating ranges that they're at, the opposition that they fight oftentimes ends up being faster and more maneuverable than them. It means that a plane like the FW190 does have to rely almost exclusively on pure boom and zoom tactics if you're playing in a competitive lobby. That's not to say that you can't do well in an FW190. You can do well in an FW190, but you're going to do well in spite of the plane's performance, not because of it. The only exception to that might be the FW190A1, and that would be on its down tier day when it probably is faster than most of the things in the lobby. But that's not going to be the normal case. Even if we add Italy to the mix, things don't really get a lot better, because if you look at planes like the G55 and the RE2005, they are essentially worse competitors to things like the Spitfire. The RE2005, the closest matchup that it has in the game as far as a dogfight is concerned, is with the F Mark 9 Spitfire. Not the LF Mark 9, but the F Mark 9 that sits at a significantly lower battle rating. The LF Mark 9, when compared to the RE2005, completely obliterates it. Same thing goes when you compare the LF Mark 9 to the G56. Really, the closest turning capability that these planes have is on par with the Griffin Spitfire. And they do this while being significantly slower. Italy's most overpowered plane relative to its battle rating isn't even Italian. It's actually the P47 D30, which is identical to the P47 D28, but gets to fight at 3.7 battle rating instead of 4.3. In a competitive setting, if you limit the Axis team to just Italy and Germany, the Allied team basically covers all of the bases. The best turning plane in the battle rating bracket is going to be Allied. The fastest plane in the battle rating bracket is probably going to be Allied. The only real performance advantage that Axis planes might have at certain battle rating ranges is going to be in terms of climb rate. At the end of the day, removing Japan from the equation, would mean that Axis teams would have a much harder time remaining competitive. You can see in the background footage that the Griffin Spitfire, the Mark 14, at 5.3, one of the least maneuverable Spitfires in the game, is really not having any trouble keeping up with the Ki-84. And this is in spite of me being relatively inexperienced with the Spitfires. I probably only have around 10 to 20 games worth of experience in Spitfires in general. Guys like Booberry, that Idaho plays with all the time, have over 500 games in just the LF Mark 9 alone. So what is more oppressive? Is it the random guy in his Ki-84 or his A6M that is turn fighting everything because he doesn't really know any better because he's new at the game and he likes the fact that the flight models are easy to fly and easy to get their performance out of them? Or is it when you do have like 3 of the most experienced players in the game squatted up and just running a train on your whole entire lobby in some of the strongest planes in the game? And I've been on both ends of it. I've been in the Super Squad, I've formed the Super Squad, I have my own version of the Super Squad, and I've been on the receiving end of being brutalized by the Super Squad. Like, for instance, Idaho complains in his video that you don't have to understand fight geometry in a Japanese plane, which is true. But also, if you're playing against Idaho in his squad, even if you understand fight geometry, if you're in a plane that is similarly matched up to his, you have 1 or 2 LF Mark 9 Spitfires glued straight to your ass within probably a minute or 2 of starting the fight. So if the fight goes on for longer than 2 or 3 turns, you're going to lose. Really, in that scenario, your best option is not to take a turn fighter. Your best option is to get in a plane that is relatively fast, that you can use the speed to dictate when and where the fight happens. And the only tech tree that can pretty much consistently do that in Sim at any battle rating range is the American one. Anyways, that really does cap out the commentary portion of the Beer Thunder episode. I am going to let it keep running because I do want to talk through the Ki-84 versus Griffin Spitfire matchup, because we did test a bunch of matchups against the Ki-84, and this was the one that I thought was the most balanced, that had kind of the most options for play and counterplay, where it did come down to who was better at managing energy, managing geometry, all that good stuff, attacks, counterattacks, and whatnot. And these fights could go on for a long time. And if something like this happens in EC, if you do get suckered into a dogfight with a Ki-84 or a Griffin, and things are relatively matched, the winner or the loser isn't really going to be who does the flight geometry thing better. The winner or the loser is going to come down to whose teammate gets there first. And this fight is really kind of indicative of a lot of fights that I have with Idaho in random games, where it really does come down to, we go in, we go at it, we have similar planes. I do try to not take the most broken thing for the bracket and try to make things a little bit competitive, but what it does come down to is whose teammate gets there first, because this fight is really, really well balanced. And as far as learning the Spitfires, like, I put some effort into it, but I haven't really spent that much time. I'd say it really equates to kind of around like 30 to 40 minutes of like flying around in test flight in a custom match with like AI targets, just to get a feel for like the low speed handling of the plane, get a feeling for the flaps. And the flaps on the plane are incredibly strong at very low speeds, but they rip really easily. So what you'll see me do a lot of the times is I'm tapping my flaps to gain a little bit of position at low speed, but trying to get them away before I pick up too much speed and they blow off. At the same time, the control sensitivity of the plane, you kind of have to ignore the bottom third of your stick motion or the bottom third of your control surface unless you're at very high speeds, because it's very easy to over-angle to attack the plane and cause a wing stall. With that being said, I really don't think this is beyond the capabilities of most experienced sim players. Albatross, the guy that I'm dueling, is a very, very strong EC player, and even in 1 versus 1s, he's able to put up a good fight and he keeps me on my toes. I would rate him pretty much just as good as Idaho, maybe a little bit worse in the finer things, and I might be a little bit better than Idaho in a 1 versus 1 scenario depending on the plane. I think that between the matchup between me and Idaho, it would be very competitive, but it would come down to who is in practice more recently, who's doing more of the right tricks and stuff. Like the 109 thing, like I spent a lot of time doing 109 duels, and there's a lot of things you can do with the plane, like the prop pitch with the thrust, and then the prop pitch with the air brake, the flaps, doing the trim turn where you use 100% trim to exceed the elevator limitations to get like a better first turn. I've done that. I have dueled against probably people that I consider to be the best at sim dueling in the game. I've dueled against Samkes. Guess what? I could almost be competitive. Almost. But it wasn't close. It destroyed me like more than a couple times. Same thing with Biscuit Destroyer's another guy who's probably the best 1 versus 1 prop player in the game. The same thing with Ace. Albatross and me, we're not quite that level. We're like touching it. We're like touching the bottom cusp of it, where me and him are able to actually play the planes to their performance differences, and that's why I didn't really spend a lot of time on the LF9 versus Key 84 matchup, because even with him having next to no experience in the LF9 and me having next to no experience in the LF Mark 9, it was relatively easy to figure it out and just get behind the Key 84 and just kind of shit all over it. Even the Griffin Spitfire is still kind of favored to win. Like in this duel, you can see that I'm working my way around him. I'm gaining a little bit of energy over him, turning just a little bit better, gaining a little bit of position, but I'm never quite in position where I can pull even more AOA and get the shot. The one kind of downside with the Spitfires, with the way that they stall, with the way that they're kind of really touchy, is it's really easy to get greedy, think that there's a shot, pull for the shot, wing stall, and then give up your position, then create that opening for the Key 84 to attack. The Key 84, on the other hand, flight model-wise, is extremely docile. It's probably the most docile plane in the game, next to all of the props that have counter-rotating props. But we are working our way behind him. We do have a chance. We are missing a flap. We did blow off one of our flaps, so we don't have that ability. And that does kind of counteract our ability to pull for a shot. But like right there, I was thinking about it. You saw the plane shudder. You saw it kind of like start to wing stall a little bit. And right there, I pulled just a little bit too hard. And that creates the opening right there that he has some space to work with now. I go up. I try to get above his guns. And he gets a hit, and I'm going to keep fighting it out. Because although I did get hit, I did get into a position I think that is workable from. But now, because I have damage, because I'm going to run out of oil, the engine's going to overheat, all the bad things are going to happen, he's probably going to win this one. He goes for a shot there, but really, the way that he won was I just got a little bit too greedy in the wing stall. Anyways, that's a Beer Thunder. Watch this duel.